Hello everyone, today we talk a bit about medieval family, medieval society. We don't touch on these topics very frequently, at least there is a hefty medieval society playlist. We, I think, created also one about medieval family as well. However, we've never been particularly specific about it. Like, it would be interesting to see this from a strictly personal, individual point of view, like moral one, a biological one, probably the life of people in general, and a bit beyond the cliches. I know that, strangely enough, I don't know whether for this video it's going to be the same. People like the concept of, let's take a look at medieval society. I criticized recently one of my videos, all those channels make, what was life like in the medieval inn? There is actually one specific channel, I gave it out in that video about the 90 top, let's say, the biggest YouTube history channels, something like that, that literally has it content about, yes, medieval knights, medieval, the sort of stereotype as a reenactor, and literally like half of the content is what was actually, but really actually life in a medieval inn. What actually happened in medieval, as if the entire Middle Ages revolved around what happened in the then inn, right? And aside from this joke, of course, there is this sense infused by structuralism, by the socioeconomical bias that would like to tell you basically there is an answer for everything, it's all predetermined, that you can't really do anything, you should sort of do without any other sort of individual concern, right, for what you can do to change the story. For which medieval society becomes just, in fact, sociology, like conflating history as a whole in its beauty with sociology, even when the latter, of course, does constitute important parts of history. And of course, you can't think that together with politics and war, society is yet the other third. It was from the Clausewitzian Trinity. But it's something, in fact, that can't, first of all, stand alone, nor that should have not heavily informed more or less this view of the Middle Ages as if basically the only way you could study it. It's not evidential, it's not political, it's not wars, it's not battles, etc. But it's mostly society and economics and data and demographics and just big numbers and stats. And that's not just about the Middle Ages, but it's about, again, this broader approach to any era, focusing just on the technical side of the story, which is also often economically tied. It's just based on an abstract sense of absolute force and not the relative means through which these media operated, and especially sort of depersonalizing the issue a bit, because it's not like the stories are along the narrative of, let's look at this particular instance of why people behave in a certain way or why. It's just like, look, there was this craft and they used these tools, and all the context, like, of the various communities, of the entire political situation, all what was happening around, and something, in fact, more spiritual, more that's still heavily informed, in fact, also the material side of the story, in fact, was detached from the same, right? And one of my dreams on Schwerpunkt is, in fact, making this video is about social history. It turned out to be fairly provocative in this sense, if anything, also through this counter-narrative, but properly social history that was that intertwined with the broader, right? You have at some point in medieval history, you think about, your ancestors in general, and we all have the peasantry in our genes at some point, right? I have literal nobility, I have third estate, I have fourth estate, and there is something deeply, striking in my view at this point of having. Once I remember that I pictured. I think it was during one of my recordings on Schwerpunkt, the epiphany of thinking of this peasantry, right, working in the fields with the heavens revolving around them, and under the sun or in the cold, no matter what, this cycle continuing again, and these guys providing the substance for those who were in charge, in fact, of the system, to give a form to the same, to bring us to where we are now. It's something deeply touching, and were we to analyze that, not in fact as much as sort of simply the technique went, because, by the way, it's not, even if you study agricultural history, for example, it doesn't stop to the tools, right? There is an enormously complicated and complex history behind how would they actually work cumulatively during the day or during the months, the seasons, the years, by the way, with a wisdom, with a practice that we have somehow lost. We may understand more or less how they worked, but from their side, it would have been really completely different from what we understand at so many levels. And at the same time, when you realize that more or less not just the surplus was ridiculous compared to our own, and that things seem to almost never change, like in a lifetime of work, but especially that the same techniques, the same technologies were at large the same. Like if you pick medieval Europe, at least especially towards the later Middle Ages, more or less. Yes, there were important divides here and there, but they would have not been noticed at the time exactly because they were that flat. And that's where actually history allows you to more easily, as perspectively, highlight what actually matter as on top of all this stuff. For the same peasantry, for example. Today we're not just talking about the peasantry, but we're talking about, let's say, the opportunities that existed within this society to emerge, but kind of glue kept this together, the contrast between the rich and the poor in a comprehensive but also cohesive fashion, meaning that for how rigged, of course, humanity by original sin it can be, still there was a societal consistency and a broader political guidance that allowed, in fact, for civilization to advance, to survive even some very important crises, and to actually deliver to us down the line actually a very positive message about history, about mankind, and more. Now, the family is important as well because, of course, it would serve as the most intimate arena where medieval individuals refined their abilities to coexist with others. This is something you can relate to all times in history to a degree. In the family, you can test, especially when it's also a more extended family, sort of a clanic structure, your own capacity for leadership or submission, celebrating personal victories, nurturing a cherished space for exchanging love and affection, which is, if anything, the most obvious and sort of relatable aspect of even the smallest individual, even in, again, their own rigged fashion. Nevertheless, beyond the confines of the family, there are also broader external domains existing in the Middle Ages where people can engage in their social, we can say instincts to a degree, but of course something more informed by reason as well. These domains varied significantly depending on whether one resided in rural hamlets or bustling urban centers, but not only. This is not the discriminant per se, otherwise this difference would have not existed in the first place. This goes on for, of course, the different centuries. Here we're not taking any one specific, maybe we have this later medieval bias, that is to say also where we can start documenting enough about the social, also the humbler social side of the story. There is also, again, a difference across the world, across Europe. Countries are different morally, politically, culturally. For example, if you look at, I don't know, the most, what are, in the sense, I think the most paradoxic but exemplificative diet, what were the two most advanced countries, more or less throughout all the period, France and Italy, right? More or less northern France, central northern Italy, that are very different countries, right? You have the feudal system lording over the former. You have the urban republics ruling in the latter. Yet the system is intertwined. They're not oppositive systems. There is not like even in the difference a denial at a hierarchical level of the necessity, for example, for a universal authority, right? And this is, as we've seen, we could say, well, Italy hosted the papacy, for example, whereas France was outside of the Holy Roman Empire. But as you know, the French had a quite clear imperial vocation, and they also put that into practice, also in tandem with the papacy, for example. Of course, we could make any comparison across Europe. There is also another, the universal theme emerging in different ways, whether, for example, in a humble rural community disputing with its lord or a neighboring group over grazing rights, such as those documented, for example, in disputes over common lands in 12th century England, recorded in manorial courts rolls. The English peasantry had it really tough at the time. I made a video about 12th, 13th century English peasant autonomy, because it was actually pretty strict compared to other Western countries. Or in the governing council of a major city deliberating political alliances. Made multiple videos explaining also how important rhetoric was in some of the most centralized powers, the richest, the most effective. For example, food provisions amid looming scarcity. Been this debated topic, the expansion of defensive walls, or the construction of a grand cathedral, as seen, for example, in the civic projects of 13th century Siena that we made videos about with its Palazzo Pubblico, or Milan's Duomo, for example. So you understand how different, if you pick, again, this random spaces from the very rural and autonomous and loosely cohesive Scandinavian communes, right, to, in fact, some of the most centralized city-states in Southern Europe, you would find some common themes that are basically the same ones around which the world has always revolved, right? It's about liberalism, conservatism. It's about the capacity of saying no as opposed to always giving into the yes. It is about being consistent with one's own political direction, setting the right goals. It's about war, right? When is war licit? When is it just advantageous? And when is it especially that you should fight one, right? Evident throughout is, of course, throughout all this world, is a profound, almost fierce devotion to one's homeland. This is a topic that many of you are interested in because, of course, let's be honest, you're mostly ethno-nationalists, and I know it very well. And we haven't really asked me this too often, but every once in a while it came up, especially in the Q&As. Recently we have seen it as well. How important was it national identity in the Middle Ages? Of course, there are different things that, different shades, different semantic properly connected with different times in history. It's obvious that by the 6th century that Nazi meant something, whereas in the 15th it meant something else that can in part be superimposed, even with our own concept of nation, but to different degrees. And this medieval attachment to the local community, I think, is very important. It's something that with Schwerpunkt, I started mostly from a background that emphasized the need of the modern man to understand the overarching, universal, ecumenical foundation as a presupposition properly for the existence of other powers, not much in a political but in a metaphysical sense. That is to say, you cannot have a human order if you don't traditionally understand that any order derives exclusively from God. And in this sense, it seems to me that we did miss some, at least of the most explicit reflections on the definitely existing national identities, or also other types of identities. Here, when we talk about homeland, it can be different things superimposed at the same time, because the world at the time had a corporative, hierarchical sense of the orders. of the estates and who had to rule them and why, right? So an incredibly traditionally enshrined vision of power, society, of war. If anything, on Schwerpunkt, we talked really a lot, and so I presume it also to be satisfactory at explaining this, at least indirectly, this topic, considering the enormous content that we've made about properly single regional powers, right? If you, aside from this videos like this one, for example, like medieval society in general, we talk about normally Europe that also entailed an identity at the time. It revolves mostly around singular, mostly national contexts, right? That we could go by order now. I don't have the list of the recent videos I made quickly at hand, but you understand how vital and important such identities are. This is not everything, of course. It is not everything for you, right? It's not like you're thinking all the single time what you can do for your homeland, right? Actually, you have also a strong desire to influence, of course, your own fortune as much as the fortune of your community, which in fact seemed deeply intertwined with one's personal destiny, as it really is in the end, because you are, if anything, emerging from that mold. And as far as properly the metaphysics, the theology of the fall and incarnation, your specific background is crucial to understand what kind of qualities you have, for better and for worse, and so what's basically your customized path to divinity, that, however, is in that sense unidirectional. The intensity of this engagement varied, of course. It was most pronounced, as surviving records eloquent attest, with the emergence and expansion of the communal movement across Europe. This may be also emphasized by the obvious political struggle that this entailed. And when we think about the communes, this phenomenon did not just happen in a urban setting. For example, there are also the rural communes that end up to be less important, more subordinated to other powers. But as we've seen often with Italian city-states that are the top example, of course, there is a striking, clarity in the historically wise concerning the fact that even though these city-states were central to these Italians, and that within themselves they basically oriented on the basis of such communities, they were still sharing basically a national identity that was also recognized abroad univocally as such, and that they also used, especially in the moment in which they went abroad themselves, without any contentiousness about it. In fact, this is what very much like the contemporary concept of nationalism tends to blind people about. That is to say, the development of a national identity is actually enriched by the belonging to other kind of identities at the same time. I mean, of course, there is not such a thing like an homogeneous national identity, but some of the strongest cultures, if you look, for example, at the level of Italian literature, civilization, general, like art, like specific national styles, and in circulation of knowledge, and this was by far the most literate, rich, interconnected, and urbanized country in the world. It had a strikingly homogeneous national identity within itself that, again, was recognized by everyone, including the Italians when they were abroad, but that within Italy was prevaricated by the belonging to one city, to one commune, basically. And this was not in contrast, right? It was not denying that. People today, I don't know if it is by, being raised, what also people today think nationalism is, which is something that frankly is different from what was in the 19th century. Their sort of 21st lame Generation Z YouTube version of what nationalism is supposed to be, which is an incredibly weak ideology, by the way, that really, let's not even skip to this. It's stronger surely than socialism or communism, but it floats on the same level of anti-traditionalism. But that is possibly combined with paradox games that want they're sort of deep enough to an extent, never played them, but that basically make people fixate with the colored blob of whichever polity that must be those boundaries, with that kind of sort of level of individual control, of unitary control, etc., that makes powers, right? As opposed to not understanding, and the Middle Ages are a very important gateway to this, like the actual superimposition of political, military power on communities that, in this sense, and this is a metaphysical concept, are not really spatially measurable, right? Of course, there is a territory, there is the communities that live on it. Of course, this is a pre-industrial system, so the land was in many ways the measure of also this power. But it was never about that. It was about mankind, and it was about the capacity, in fact, of single city-states that had just like a district of a few 100 square meters fielding armies as large as the ones of the King of France on a regular basis. So, and all for this kind of specific local identity, right? We made before the name of Siena or Milan. I made multiple videos about those, the Italian communes, etc. And we explained pretty well how, at which levels different identities were working. What can we say about this? This, again, there are other examples as well. In central and northern Italy, where cities like Florence, Bologna, Venice achieved the political autonomy of small states, establishing their notorious self-governing communes that wielded significant political, social power, often formalized through statutes and charters that defined civic rights and responsibilities, such as in the Florentine Ordinances of Justice of 1293. I made multiple videos about, first of all, medieval law. As of all, some of those videos have to re-upload because they were before 2021. Not of them. Actually, I think I finished the series last year. And then you have I also made some videos specifically about the say, Florentine history, mostly through this kind of constitutional scanning that is quite much the measure of such political developments. And we have, if you remember these videos, you have seen how complex the social allegiances were in, however, producing literally the most successfully cohesive communities of the era. So again, never mistake infight for weakness. This is a topic we'll have to discuss also in the videos about traditional religion. Because there is a result to that is what you see from the outside, eventually, the way political action is really taken. And you realize that, of course, the less conflictual systems were also very often the most stagnating ones. But look at the Byzantine Empire. It's not like we have a history of a historiography probably of Byzantine social unrest, right? Of course, it existed to a degree, but it's incomparable to Western powers, and these were definitely not less successful than the Byzantine Empire that they also took over. And again, as you know, I can't say I'm specializing on this specific, in fact, historiographical niche of showing how much we inflated Byzantine effectiveness, especially when people still want to make the case that the West was some sort of barbaric dark hole that produced nothing at any time and was divided, so it was weaker. But there are many people who literally think that this is the case, while we, of course, document on Schwerpunkt, also just through the very notorious historiography, that the diametrically opposite is actually true. It must be acknowledged that for the previous centuries of the Middle Ages, like, say, more or less the early ones, the scarcity of written records does not always clarify whether This reflects an absence of the collective rights and ambitions discussed, or rather, at least in part, a result of the decline in scarcity in written documentation during periods of crisis, such as the collapse of centralized authority following the fall of the Roman Empire and the subsequent disruptions of the Carolingian Empire, fragmentation in the 9th and the 10th centuries, which left surviving charters or chronicles from peripheral regions. Medieval civilization, however, in my opinion, gives a striking response. We'll see once again, and that's a bit my leitmotif whenever we discuss the later centuries of the Middle Ages, is to say the fact that the mid-14th century crisis was a massive one. It was an intercontinental, it was a global one, and that really struck very, very deeply into the heart of medieval civilization. Still did not take it down, all right? Unlike late antiquity, that somehow evaporated on the basis of its own ruins, we could say, that in part were still what allowed for later development to blossom again, as we will very well know. And we should be really careful, in fact, when by not seeing sources, we assume that nothing was going on, which is also not quite what you see in the early Middle Ages, even in Western Europe, that would have been allegedly the backward one, and that it turns out, video after video, that is quite not the case at all, especially compared to the East, and so therefore to anybody, because the Byzantines were also a hell of a civilization in absolute terms. But late medieval Europe did not die. Admittedly, also, medieval civilization in other countries did not simply die. There are some differences actually around. I'm not going to make comparisons today because this is not the case for the video topic. But indeed, we know that the Renaissance, modern Europe, and also even some parts of contemporary Europe are definitely medieval civilization. Right? There is not an end of the Middle Ages. There's not a moment in which, again, there was ever any darkness, and if you want to speak to this lack of documentation for 150 years at the longest, at the very beginning of the Middle Ages. And it's really notorious that, especially the great peak of medieval civilization in the 13th and 14th century, was an overwhelmingly, and I want to stress overwhelmingly advanced civilization that by far surpassed also most of the modern age, in size and in actual comprehensive capacities of universalizing knowledge and, being capable of really seeing things through, and by demographics, by actual wealth. But the actual size of cities, this is notorious. This is valid also for a great part of antiquity, as in comparison. And that, in fact, was, in a sense, even too big to die, right? It's not like civilization historically provides us with this too edifying concept without the counterpart of enormous pain and suffering at all time. That's definitely not the case. But we are looking at a system that, in particular, and I know better because it specialized exactly in those few decades of passage from the early 14th century to the crisis, which is respectively the peak and of medieval civilization and the crisis, that in that instance, actually, documentation literally booms and escalates in the moment of the crisis, right? It had already been escalating before, but in the moment of the crisis, there is what we would call a modernization, a secularization that actually prompts this necessity of writing, of trying to salvage, to account, and that really starts most of what we conceive like modern literature, in a way. There are beautiful examples, literally wise, about this. I created a playlist about medieval literature that deals in part with different examples at some point. We talked about Jean Froissart, that is it's slightly later, but it embraces part of this. We talked about other sources. We will get really into chronicles, etc., because it's overbearingly important to really see even how in a lifetime of particular chroniclers this was witnessed as a change, but also how much they didn't really. You would think that, yes, the Black Death, for example, dominated the news in the chronicles. You would find, obviously, some references to that, but it's not like it was central, right? Once that paragraph maybe dedicated to it was over, there was the rest of normal political military history that dominates the thing. And people sensibly, as self-evidently understood that even the change was in act, because it's not really true that people in history don't understand what's going on in the moment. But exactly because they know what's going on in the moment, they don't stop along the way. That there is a lot to do in the process. There is an incredibly destabilized system. There are the usual plus the new challenges. It's a bit what we are looking at right now historically. So it's really an important sort of comparison you can trace at different levels wherever you are. Reconstructing the perspectives of ordinary individuals, of course, is really challenging. This is very difficult to do even for the educated elite that left us these beautiful works, as well as for powerful figures about whom we really know more, including their literally, their childhood or something. And as we were saying, that there is an apparent stability even in what we would understand today as some sort of endemic instability. Of course, in the pre-industrial world, polities were more unstable. But if you actually look at it from perspective, you realize, first of all, that civilization calls for further civilization. Like it's really difficult to find an instance where, for example, the greater powers were simply knocked out of the game. Even after the greatest crisis, look at the Kingdom of France, for example. Look at even where wealth basically remained in Europe for centuries, even with the opening of the Atlantic routes, etc. Like you can't actually unsee how successful medieval civilization at the end of the day was, and how competent the people running it, generally speaking, were. It's the potential for transformation, we can use it in this way, and the understanding that the individual would have all that is very difficult to simply discuss, right? The other impression you have when you read these sources is that people were more, I can't say fatalistic, but they seem to, for example, confer to the same written notice a different meaning from our own. They were more into life, lived life, into action, into fighting, dying, loving. Everything was lived more intensely, and you can argue that the same literacy was in part just a gradual detachment from that, from a society that was parting from the more traditional world, even just out of this sense of exhaustion. And that's why the moment of crisis was paradoxically producing, not just during the Middle Ages, but in many other moments of actual crisis, some level of reflection, or even of withdrawal towards a more contemplative life, because, let's say, the active one had been a failure to a degree. It's also particularly challenging during the Middle Ages, of course, to research beneath this higher social sources. In a way, there are some interesting things like proto-cadastre. There are very actually insightful notions about, and we reconstructed it pretty well historically, about social dynamics, about political feelings, etc. So it's not like we don't know what a large society was like. We know that fairly well. It may not be precise, but it's accurate. What we can't pin in a very solid fashion is in fact, the average person's opinion. Because they didn't write at large, even when they did, they didn't really feel the need in that world to see this writing as something particularly useful, just also to describe what. They were not incentivized to simply explain their own personal issues, because they were understood to be, first of all, very common, and to the most tragic dimension, in fact, very human. And so there was religion, if anything, to address those. And if anything, when you look at the devotional literature available, etc., you realize that people counted very much on their faith and on their beliefs, and they went largely by that, as it is supposed to be, traditionally speaking. Even though from that you can see as well different inclinations, as we will observe now, politically wise, and not only. It's widely accepted that the Church's teachings, in fact shaped by the learned, extended beyond scholarly circles to permeate both the establishment and the lower strata, promoting acceptance of social position to which each person and family was born. It was one with that sense of necessary unity that a community must uphold in moments of crisis, even at great cost. At a certain point, a tripartite model emerged that, as you know, categorized society into three estates. This reflected the historically traditional, sort of universal, and for Europe, Indo-European view of the estates: those who prayed for all, the oratores; those who fought and protected all, the bellatores; and those who labored for all, the laboratores. We'll come back on the traditional doctrine of the case, as I'm promising you to make the video about probably how estates came into being and what they really meant, aside from this more sort of adulterated way of addressing them that we have today, as if it was just, I don't know, mere symbol, and it wasn't probably even both a genetic and metaphysical substance and form to the same. This tripartite framework, which is also debated because, and frankly, as far as I've seen, only by people who have some problem with the idea that there is some Indo-European legacy for this. For example, at university, I never got into a debate about this, but even professors have actually, and I can assure you, of objectively very high knowledge, were rejecting that by saying, no, because look, you have, and you could have all the sort of highly sophisticated criticism. It went down just to something like, because look, they superimposed, like there were laboratores, we were also bellatores, because I don't know, you had the militiamen that went at war, you have the knights that were also monks. What does that mean, right? Tradition does not actually tell anything about that. It's not like orders, estates, and more cannot develop along the pattern of how actual nature unfolds. Of course, it would be considered by the same people in the time, say, an approximation as far as humanity was concerned, but metaphysically this was not an approximation, nor the actual separation in actual social fact in the time was actually a myth at all, right? So nobody really, if anything, like for somebody to make this criticism, it simply reveals just from their side a structuralistic bias in terms of like estates were radically rigid categories. You don't understand what they saw and understood, this literal incarnations of different communities alike in the era. So again, we will have to expand on this quite importantly. And this tripartite framework, articulated also by medieval theologians like Adalbert of Laon, Gerard of Cambrai in the early 11th century, we're talking also authoritative sources that were much better acquainted with traditional thinking than our own, aimed to, let's say, impose further order on a complex social reality. Why? Especially because in that time, there were many different communities rising, as we've seen, like the communes, for example, to unprecedented power, loosening the feudal constraints, etc. But in a sense, never denying the fact that it was an actual hierarchy and an imperial. So when you debunk, in fact, the structuralistic understanding, we were talking about it just the other day regarding the waning of feudal warfare. What does actually feudal mean? Right? Do you think that at some point there was, oh my God, look, the communes are breaking the feudal order? They would have not even properly articulated a phrase like this in order to describe what was going on, because the way imperial power, for example, was bestowed and subcontracted, delivered, would have just followed also the recognition, for example, of the communes rights, as it happened, for example, by Frederick Barbarossa as well. Again, imperial authority was recognized by the same communes that had won even in arms against the emperor. So it's a completely different sense that unfortunately some people get from the notion that history is about social struggles, class struggle, even worse. And that, again, any other consideration must be reduced to that. It evidently was. And this is why it doesn't make any sense to presume that the estate's hierarchy and order, while existing and being hyper-real, so much more real than any other definition you can give, but those time standards, was also, of course, witnessing sort of like the same action of individuals and groups define, for example, a deterministic, in fact, just I was born in this estate, so I will just remain always in this one. That's not what estates were created for. That's also the negative bias against the doctrine of the castes. The castes are not imposed by someone. They are just how the social strata end up, piling on the basis of actual virtue and earning of the Holy Ghost ad imperium. And they especially all follow one another in this hierarchy. It's not like they're separated, or I don't know, the ones at the bottom are parasitically exploited by this. It's just like the complete delirium of the last couple of centuries, complete lack of traditional notions. It's not even as if in the last couple of centuries somebody hadn't studied and explained why, in fact, this narrative doesn't make any sense. But indeed, you have peasants, for example, amassing wealth through land acquisition. Well, we know it pretty well. Of course, at some point, most people were peasant, but at some point there was more wealth around, and you see this very well from the surplus of the great medieval civilization. Again, cities, cathedrals, different estates before did not quite exist with that power. So they were at large like most of the same groups that had also become richer. So what's strange about that? Nobody really knows. The same will also recruitment in the entire Romano-Germanic world, just to make an example, were based on wealth, right? It was already there, right? You could, if you got more wealth for some reason, you could be in the other class. So nobody really understands what was the problem with the tripartite order, regardless also of its more Indo-European, really universal. It was like this in every other place. And technically still is to some extent. The same goes for any possibility of, for example, this new rich to participate, market and trade. You have, for example, I don't know, there are many examples of this also scattered in different relative and absolute measure. Peasant markets in 10th century Saxony. Definitely not a particularly developed land by the time, but one where, in fact, you see from previous times an important development of markets developing out of the new towns that had been founded since the Carolingians had at least secured a more concentrated power from these pre-existing settlements. Serfs rising to join the martial aristocracy through military service or manumission. This had always existed. Also, the Romans had castes, and this is exactly how they elevated conquered peoples to a higher degree. For not talking about probably the catalyzing importance of self-sacrifice in holy combat, also and especially at the following of your own lord. That is not necessarily like you have to be a serf. You can be a knight and doing the same with your king. Right, it would be the same identical process of improvement out of merit, because this life was more risky and yet more rewarding when successful. We see this pretty well, for example, documented in manorial records from 10th century France, where, as you know, a hell of a military class was being engineered, especially at this point. These achievements point to underlying ambitions and desires, as you understand, even where we can't properly document them. These desires were often fueled by opportunities created by, somebody would say, you see, it's economic growth. And why was economic growth there? These were people willing right? People taming nature, wanting to break out of its constraints, wanting to elevate. Stupid economicistic answers are just for the Marxists. That they do not belong to people with human dignity. And so the same way you can see the loosening of feudal constraints, you realize the same, for example, peak of feudal culture. This is also very interesting, and this is especially a feature that you see in an essentially a staggering level of uniqueness in the West. The fact that the Latin Germanic world, while peaking at a feudal level, was also peaking at the level of autonomous development, of communal development, for example. This was unseen in the Byzantine and the Arab worlds, where basically the world was more or less crystallized. Of course, people had different, they could rise to the top in different ways. Think about, I don't know, even the Mamluks or whatever. But fundamentally, the system did not give any particular sign of autonomy and promotion down the line. In the West, the peak of feudal cavalry is also the peak of, communal infantry. You don't have really a denial. This system allows to nurture these autonomies as actually backing the same leadership, whether they in fact live in feudal courts or in communal palaces. This is incredibly important to understand the essence of the West. As we said before, made example between France and Italy, because they are the actual leaders. They're not subordinated to one another, but they're very different countries, politically and socially wise. They are also similar in other ways, but in general, right? Think about, the similarities, the Romance background, the Roman vestiges, the historical connection between France, and say the Frankish world and the papacy, and more, right? Aside from just the geographical proximity. But again, this is incredibly important because you have alliances between people coming from this very different background. Think about during the 13th century, the Angevin, Capetian French power aligning itself with the most popular communal Florentine one to take over Sicily and to make, in the process, within the same Italy, that Guelph Tuscany blossom in the same way. So any kind of, this system was against this other, just why? Because of socio-economical factor, BS. Again, we should completely erase any of this notion from any book because they do not actually describe reality. All right? If you single out one factor and pretend that to be the only thing that matters, the only thing you should focus on, especially because of your agenda making people believe that the means of production are more important than people, you're not a morally and scientifically developed, fully developed human being. You're just a lesser person, and you should be treated as such, right? And in the West, we love beauty, right? And lesser people do not have beauty. This is power. This is God-given right to rule over the rest of the world. And this is exactly what this civilization did during the Middle Ages. Particularly during, if you look at especially at the literal explosion that occurred between the 10th and the 13th century, in relative terms, not even the industrial revolutions had this level of growth, right? Relatively to the actual potential, economical potential of the times, I personally do not know, maybe with possible exception, something like Middle Republican Rome or something, the overall explosion of 10th to 13th century Europe is unheard of in the entire history of mankind. And the actual reason why the West eventually took over the world, and the world is fundamentally a product of the West in this sense today, is this, all right, which is an eminently continental European, continental meant literally in the sense that it came from the land, right? There wasn't like an external factor that prompted this. This is, of course, crisis from the other side, yes, but why was this crisis happening? If you study that, it's literally in parallel to the expansion of the West, that by far surpassed the other systems at that point. This And in fact, this has nothing to do with the heavy plow and three-field crop rotation. It's the other complete and utter socioeconomicistic BS that you hear all the time. For example, the heavy plow appears first in countries that were definitely not the most developed around, such as Bohemia, right? And the most fertile, the richest, the most economically performing countries out there still kept like the light plow that they used in Roman times. So it's not to say to the Bohemians, okay, you did wrong with this. Absolutely not. It's very positive. In fact, Bohemia was participating to this massive boom, but it has not, like, the technology in itself does not indicate anything in absolute terms, all right? It doesn't even come close to do so. We're not talking about the three-field crop rotation. This is something that just occurred because of the availability of resources. It wasn't because, you had to teach a medieval peasant at some point, oh my God, we can make the three-field crop rotation. We never thought about that. This is literally what every peasant would have done had they had the means at some point. So that's the other colossal BS. Besides, if you actually study the medieval crop rates throughout mostly like this, say, the second half of the Middle Ages, you realize that while it's absolutely true, and even though the ways to calculate this are incredibly debatable, because in fact we don't have the clear picture of it all, there are some areas, often at a provincial level, that we can observe having increased their crop rates, the crop yields. There are instances of the contrary, also in very rich places, right, during this alleged agricultural revolution that was absolutely not a revolution. Like, whoever uses the term revolution, aside from, describing, regime changes, like in the most classical, you talk about the French, the Bolshevik revolution, whatever, is just a charlatan, all right? That there is no such thing like technological revolutions in any period in the history of mankind, right? And even if technology is important in relative terms, it's just the product of much more scalarly, magnitudinally larger events that have been going on. In the meanwhile, they are eminently moral. They're essentially moral, political, and social. All right, technology is just a reflection of that, and very often also pretty lame, materialistic, and one that is not conducive per se to any specific achievement other than what has already been, in fact, accumulated by mankind at that point. So we could tell about much else, but that there are ups and downs, and that this is also the reason why, if you think about it, oh my God, this technological revolution, the agricultural revolution was so great. So why would the Jacquerie in France happen, right, in 1358? Of course, there were other factors that were more important, eminently not agriculture, even though agriculture was the by far most overwhelming form of resources generation at the time. And of course, also the crisis of Jacquerie was triggered by, say, peasant issues, rather the fact that, now these had remained without protection after the French army had been annihilated by the English at Poitiers. And I always point out how proud I am to have made a video about that battle that I consider one of the most beautiful ones in the Middle Ages, 1356, Black Prince's masterpiece. And it's just a very fine example of how, in fact, technology has nothing to do with the battle, including for the English longbow, and the English won. And again, not because of the longbow, at least not even closely for the longbow to constitute any meaningful factor in the equation while fighting against the French. And I made lots of videos about the topic as well. So, at this point, I can't always say, I already explained this, deal with it. But again, the Jacquerie, there is a problem because, again, there's this astronomical ransom that must be paid for John II was captured in battle, as you have to ransom the king. There is massive taxation, labor demands, plus in a moment in which the English are basically ravaging the countryside. That's why the thing happened. And definitely, say, this is the moment of the crisis. There has been the Black Death and all, but it's not like this was such a worse time than, I don't know, the 10th century to live in, for which we admire this mechanism. So again, be extremely careful about what kind of logic you're trying to extrapolate from a specific historical events, because simplistic and monofactorial explanations are quite dangerous, to say the least. It's also wrong to think that the laboratories were, and I made a video about the value, the importance of the laboratories as well, to prove that I don't have any prejudice, that also the fourth estate is, and depending on how you see the fourth estate, because we were talking about it in the video about the patricians and the plebeians, because what's the third, what's the fourth, were habituated to separate to an extent, but what were the medieval peasants, right? There isn't a univocal medieval peasant. Also, laborator is the guy that, labor in the sense is the fatigue, right, in Latin, right? So maybe the merchant would have not been seen at that point in history, since we live in a moment of great mercantile development, of course, especially in the later Middle Ages, as another estate compared to the peasant that broke his back in the fields. But what about the early Middle Ages? It's not too clear, right, as a distinction. Things changed. And so the fact that the laboratories, in fact, were just peasants toiling on the land across Europe in that kind of atmospheric way we described before, it's not entirely correct. This overlooks the, in fact, significant internal divisions within this various estates, such as, again, the hierarchy, even among the same peasants. There were peasants that were fundamentally well off even, and others that were basically starving to death at a point during a certain cyclical crisis. And the same can be said, I don't know, about the clergy. Like, the bishop is not a parish priest, as a knight is not just his feudal lord higher in the vassalic chain. More critically, the label of laboratores may be inadequate at other different levels. As early as the year 1000, and even earlier, but especially after this symbolic date, it became difficult to classify those who did not belong to the warrior or clerical estates merely as this other sort of vague group. The growing artisanal sector, with craftsmen producing goods in burgeoning urban workshops, posed some challenges. But it was primarily the rising and increasingly vital realm of commerce, banking, and diverse financial ventures, exemplified by the growth of merchant guilds and early banking houses like the Bardi and Peruzzi in Florence and Siena, that rendered the concept insufficient. Of course, there is, even within between these extremes, an enormous divide, right? Because if I am a smith, an armor, living, again, in one of these cities, for example, and I belong to my own guild that also more or less lives in the same sectors of the city, and we are actual citizens, which, frankly, in the basis of the Romano-Germanic sort of metaphysics, still means that you are basically a nobleman, and you have, let's say, you go really literally at war. Just that's the fact, right? You can a laborator being simply a bellator, because there were peasants at some point. They were even well equipped enough by, for example, their own communes that are not merely just people of labor, even though they were quite exploited also as far as manpower was concerned, right? Frankly, I can say this, that probably, and I don't say it almost really at any time, but the greatest myth that I can think of in a general sense of medieval warfare, at least in a almost pictorial fashion, is that the most medieval armies were constituted by peasants, in the sense of people like, I don't know, going at war with pitchforks, all right? So yes, many would, maybe not with just with pitchforks, say with pole arms, but say if you look at 13th, 14th century armies, the largest of medieval civilization, you realize that these guys were at large very well equipped, right? They had even coats of mail, especially in the first ranks, of course, pikes. They had important collective training. So you can't speak about that weird rabble that, in a sense, also was not really useful militarily wise at any point. Even the same rota system established in some of the poorest, less developed areas of Europe would provide, in fact, with a decent equipment, even the sort of final rank peasant. So, of course, it was still like a pretty basic equipment, but it wasn't just literally, again, peasants cowed into, major expeditions just for the sake of numbers or whatever. So there is, within the same communities, some very soundly sophisticated divide in terms of power and of responsibility, of autonomy, of management. So the various divides, estates-wide in medieval Europe, can't really be big. There is also a psychological divide that further widens the equation, and the moral dimension, as you know, is the most important indeed. That's basically the most important factor in history. If you really want to get down to what actually makes history, it's moral forces. Trash material, like that is true, right? But pieces of things do not do things, all right? So it's indeed a moral dimension. And the moral dimension is also very malleable and potentially infinite, even. For example, particularly in urban centers and among the urban elite, we observe not only positive reflections, but also self-affirmations of personal and familiar achievements within society. This was something that, for example, some certain urban communities had strayed continuously since Roman times, because there are certain cities that simply go through without anybody ever thinking, as it's often also thought in general, that the cities died at some point in the early Middle Ages. This is absolutely not true at so many different levels, but still. But these examples also demonstrate the capacity to gain prominence in diverse fields such as literature, religious institutions, warfare, trade, and production, as evidenced by the patronage of arts and learning by wealthy merchants in 14th century Italy. We made an entire video about this arts and crafts, such as, for example, the sponsorship of frescoes by Giotto in Florence's churches. So we're talking about basically almost the single most important artistic thing ever happened in the entire history of mankind, with no comparison around any other, in any other culture in the globe. It literally stemming from the fact that such a very autonomous, at some point, people really thinking, okay, we want this, we want to see this, we want this kind of worldly representation, we want really beauty to be at the center of moral superiority, and describing the imperial Catholic tradition based on the golden divine essence of the chosen people of God. So this is what the space, what in my opinion literally indicates the superiority and the inferiority of a culture, right? Literally, if you're not able to conceive this, or you conceive it and you're not able to actually enact this, you're not as important as another culture. And the example I wanted to do here specifically is that all these various crafts, right? We tend also to stick mostly to the arts and crafts, again, the socio-economical thing, the big guild of the later Middle Ages. But if you look at how societies were organized slightly before, we even within the same cities, you had mostly some clans. They were mostly militarily led, so they maintained actually within the same clans the same estate order, and then subordinated all these other different figures like notaries, doctors, armors, whatever, that organically constituted this micro-universe within the bigger one. This is the corporative mentality of the Middle Ages, and this is what makes the solidity. Again, we've said it before, this is an incredibly conflictual system, but these groups, the cells that constitute this organism, are so incredibly powerful and strong and organized and disciplined and incredibly performing, also militarily wise. So they are able to express this beauty. And again, so you can have this other different subordinated specialties that at some point rise also to international relevance. For example, clothing, housing, dining habits at some point become a veritable field of specialization for specific service sellers, right? The respect and loyalty of those lower in the social order had long signified social distinction and prominence, meaning that if I have so many people, say, following me, either at war or in working directions, I'm actually the guy in charge. This is a very traditional idea of direction, of vision, of rationale, of control, of power, and more. In fact, as society grew more complex, due in fact not to economic progress, but moral superiority, particularly when you look at, again, the overall expansion of between the 11th and 13th centuries, this is not the commercial revolution. I don't understand why we have to, again, I do understand, unfortunately, the Marxists being given in post-World War II democracies that corner of indoctrination in higher education, unfortunately. But let's say, how can a person be so less of a human being to wanting to, again, to hysterically divert the attention from the wall just by looking at impersonal, materialistic interpretation of the same history, right? The economical factor is just, if anything, a consequence of a broader societal one that is in turn subordinated to a political one. There's no doubt that commerce can be a good indicator of this development, right? If you look at the expansion of trade routes like the Champagne fairs, and with the Mediterranean mostly, we made multiple videos on the topic, by the way. These markers of expansion became ever more evident, ever more conspicuous, and more varied, more specialized, obviously, because the system was more complex. Alongside nobles and warriors of varying ranks that were largely also the guy who had, in the beginning of this, properly funded the system, and high and low clergy, a lay society emerged in which artisans, merchants, doctors, notaries, and, though lagging behind peasants, cultivated distinct characteristics, even in their attire, and fostered a unique pride in their professions, often expressed through guild affiliations and civic roles, such as the participation of guild members in city governance in 13th century Ghent. I also made a video about medieval Ghent, or the Arte della Lana in Florence. Again, this identity went beyond. I don't know if you've ever seen for example, this Arte della Lana coat of arms. We used it in the videos about Florence. This is, of course, the wool guild. This was one of the most important one in Europe, really, because Florence, as you know, was specializing, as most, in fact, the cities in Flanders, in Italy, central northern Italy, in textile production, getting the wool from other countries and then working it. And, of course, the symbol of the Arte della Lana is a lamp, right? The lamp is actually the Agnus Dei, of course. And this, of course, goes far beyond the wool itself, right? These, again, guilds controlled entire sectors of the population that identified, in part, by the way, with the guilds and with other, with the broader community as well, at different levels. They were all organically part of what was understood of the empire, of the Christian church, and more, other identities. This display of status, precisely because society was now mentally receptive to innovation and personal success, also posed risks for those who overindulged, sparking envy. Hence, the communists want to steal your property. This led to the peculiar sumptuary laws prevalent in many regions, such as those in 13th century Florence and Venice, which restricted lavish clothing and feasts, actually for reasons that were not communistic in this case, because, again, in the lower ranks you would find those who really would have liked to overthrow the system, to destroy everything in the first place, and again, having this short-term understanding of everything and wanted to do that. If anything, not to try to unbalance the system towards oligarchic, monopolic one. And we've seen it in various videos, including probably the ones of the Venetian Constitution recently. The elites indeed were striving to the top. Sometimes these were, again, very ambitious elites that contributed to the same shortcoming of the system through political strife and competition. This was particularly evident in the second half of the 14th century, where indeed medieval civilization was shattered. In fact, they were the first guys to display such extravagance, so that a common sense of morals said, okay, this is too much. Very often these guys were sanctioned for luxury, for excess display of luxury, were some of the most populistic and demagogic elements of society that paradoxically bonded, today we would call them radical chic, right, with lesser people from the fourth estate. And so endangering the entire system, making leverage, if anything, just on the masses that fortunately enough are overall morally weak compared to the higher estates. That's why the system here does not go upside down. There's not such a thing like a communist revolution in medieval Europe, simply because people had the attributes at the time to simply prevent even the possibility of this. But in some of the most shattered systems, as we've seen before with the Jacquerie, and again, I made multiple videos about the peasants' revolts, the crisis of the later Middle Ages, really at least tried to fail. They all failed, by the way. Like, there is not a single successful peasant rebellion during the later Middle Ages that went anywhere. If not, we can think even just about the Dispatch, places that were so isolated that they didn't make a difference, and they were, in fact, overall irrelevant. Civilization is always marked by, in fact, its own solidity. So at their core, this sumptuary laws had the Christian principle of avoiding offense to the poor by flaunting wealth and success, which practically meant preventing such displays from inciting rebellion, as seen in the Sumpter Revolt of 1378 in Florence, where textile workers rose against sort of differences stemming from wage suppression and guild exclusion. It's not like in Christianity you can't just display wealth and power, but you should do it in a way that is functional to the entire system. So the idea that luxury could simply be piled up without any further investment, this was pretty notorious also in pre-Christian morality, just in traditional morality, and was part of the reason why such sort of useless aesthetical exhibitionism was morally criticized. And in fact, this was the ultimate point of, say, this sanctions. We can read it, for example, in the same merchant account books and civic ordinances of the period. Even in the detailed ledgers of the Datini Company in Prato, that handled an enormous amount of money, but definitely knew how to invest it further. This highlights a key facet of the era's mindset, or rather a point of tension between spending and waste versus saving and wealth building, marking another temporal and social divide in the long medieval period. Spending and gift-giving to showcase status, secure and maintain followers were deeply rooted in essential practices for the warrior and seigneurial estates, earning them loyalty, because this still entailed redistribution of the loot, for example, admiration and respect. This is something anthropologically observable. Also, we've seen in the steppes where, for example, you can't bring wealth together. I mean, you can't... It's not advisable to leave wealth anywhere. It's better for you to have it with you. And so you would have more lavish equipment if, especially in that miserable world, you had any surplus whatsoever. So that you could be seen from a distance, say, as a more powerful warrior, a sort that had won that hopefully through prowess, through killing other enemies, and so was also a better warrior. You understand how these people reason. But you can see some of the same standards displayed in feudal courts of 12th century France and England, where lavish banquets, for example, and tournaments reinforce social bonds with very solid function, right? It was a problem to spend so much for tournaments. There were some religious concerns, like why do you have to pay so much for these kind of clashes? They're also very violent. People died in that. Go fight against the Saracens if you have to. But these were also functional activities to effect the provision of that, the conferment of that collective training at such an extraordinary level among the say the military, that again could have definitely channeled, like it happens in history at different times, their efforts towards a specific enemy rather than having internal issues and all, but still obtaining gradually that result. Commercial activities, lending, borrowing money, and new estates of artisans and traders emerged during this point, particularly with the rise of urban centers and long-distance connection, like power wielding at an unprecedented scale. You can see this at different times in the Middle Ages, different places. For example, the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe was a pretty good case. I made an entire video about that. Or the Silk Road connections through Venice. If anything, we haven't talked too much about the Silk Road, but we talked very much about the Italian global trade at that point. New ideas took root, sharply opposing those just described. Thus, also the attitude towards wealth changed, because, again, literally by the 12th century, the amount of wealth that was starting being accumulated was unprecedented in a broader cultural memory sense. When we look at the later Middle Ages, things start changing in many ways. People are richer, the system is more affluent. Even after a crisis, again, there are some standards that haven't really reverted to some more primitive times. And wealth was understood at the end of the day as the product of divine favor in any case. So reflecting at least some virtue. This is evidenced by the writings, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, who grappled with the morality of profit and usury. So they were distinguished in that sense in his Summa Theologica. Merchants, like the same merchants, discuss this in their trade manuals. One is very famous by Francesco Pegolotti. These two sets of attitudes did not merely coexist chronologically, they collided, especially in the closing centuries of the medieval era, when the warriors, the lords, the nobility confronted with the new so-called bourgeois estate, born out of this mostly mercantile practice, to a degree that was impossible just not to notice or to appreciate, given the means that, in fact, the Third Estate was providing the same authority with. As we've seen, for example, in the videos about Louis XI, who literally dressed up as a merchant to trigger the French nobility that variously tried to rebel against successful monarchic concentration, by the way, at that point. So this was not essentially a clash of estates either, as the noblemen themselves also instrumentally fell victim, so to say, to the new estate's careful financial management due to their traditional spending habits. Marriage between, even at the royal level, with some powerful bankers from the Third Estates really happened. Some newly wealthy individuals sought to emulate or align with noble lords themselves, as seen in the ennoblement of wealthy merchants, for example, in 14th century Italy. And you can see later again the marriage between the House of France and the same Medici family's rise to prominence that had been a precondition also for that international marriage at that point. So again, the proof against France and Italy, it's the magic diet here. fitting this kind of commixtion. It's also just a matter of power. You can't be... we explain in a sense the difference between the patricians and the plebeians. Here it starts getting a bit out of hand, especially because the same later medievals in the Renaissance, they did not fully or necessarily believe the same identical things in the same way. But it's also just a matter of actual power, right? And so there can be people belonging to different estates across Europe, but that are astronomically separated by actual power and wealth. In the same way, indeed, the same notion that would be some sort of estate identity based on opportunism is at times correct, meaning that estates were, as we've seen, quite informing and quite seriously describing your own background and more. But the same noblemen that, for example, would criticize Louis XI in that way had their own dealings with merchants, and so it's not like even the king liked them in particular, but they were a useful tool. Of course, there is in general modernization, secularization of mindset in this period that applies to the whole of humanity, that starts gradually parting from the more primitively original way of life and beliefs, even detaching from its understanding. This is particularly evident, again, after the late medieval crisis. There is also a tendency to portray adversaries by emphasizing flaws that could appear as corruptions of their core qualities, spending depicted as extravagance and squandering, which could be said even just about a monarch's policy. From the other side, this is the point that, would fuel to some degree, the English Civil War later in the day. In fact, prudent resource management could even be labeled as greed, as reflected by contemporary chronicles that critiqued both aristocratic excess and bourgeois avarice, such as Giovanni Villani's Nuova Cronica, that we will surely have at some point to cover in a dedicated video. Distinguishing where one ended and the other began was naturally difficult, particularly in varied social contexts and with different needs. The strain this opposition caused is evident, for instance, in how upper bourgeois group attuned to noble values loaded a frugal mindset open to generosity, as seen in the charitable foundations established by merchants in 14th century Brugge, such as hospitals and almshouses, while nobles and lords embraced more cautious generosity and resource management, including ventures into new areas like banking, such as the involvement of aristocratic families in the Bardi and Peruzzi banking houses, beyond traditional land-based exploitation. And we know that those same bankers funded most of the military expenses of England and France in the era. This one in parallel also with a specific consolidation of this means of wealth extraction, meaning if you, for example, these people were largely speaking self-made men, or at least they had emerged from from a pretty spontaneous dynamic in a way, always actually led by the higher estates in a way or another that had historically and would remain in charge again, regardless of the of the different levels of power across Europe, and even the fact again that these estates would live, as a matter of fact, as them, right? There are instances of this that the people coming from a third estate background would become, as we've seen, noblemen on their own regard in the end. So there was this mean of elevation. But if you subcontract, for example, some resources to these bankers and you contribute to essentially recapitalizing them in moments of need, right, you will also establish some kind of, you will co-opt them and you will establish some kind of local order or balance that will help you not just extracting money, but politically and socially stabilizing the landscape. In the Church's official Orthodox doctrine, noting that the Middle Ages were marked by heterodox and occasionally heretical movements, such as the Waldensians and Cathars, where alternative teachings challenging social hierarchies by advocating for apostolic poverty and communal living, urged contentment with one's social position. In fact, equating rebellion with sin. This is relevant because, of course, the Catholic ideology is, as we've seen, permanently concerned with maintaining such unity of intents, and it's not a surprise that the heretical movements would always emerge at its fringe as fundamentally communistic systems. We just were talking about it the other day, even as far as the Roman Empire was concerned. As you know, the Roman Empire, even before Christianity, was a Catholic empire. And I will repeat it ad nauseum, and of course I stopped explaining it every time I make the anecdote because I made multiple videos about also this literally notorious notion, if you've never really understood what Catholic means and that all great empires, historically speaking, were Catholic, in at least probably the older traditional empires, it's a bit difficult to go around the world to achieve anything to begin with. And so the idea of societal cohesion was really relevant. In fact, this Catholic understanding was not even aiming at preventing status changes at all. If anything, the Catholic Church promoted the development of the same Christian world, and quite successfully so, by the way. If anything, heresies were instead endangering that and preventing, in fact, the struggle to bring to the further expansion of Catholicism, also over the enemies of the Christian faith, including their own, themselves, I mean. And this is the actual issue in many ways. The Church also preached love among men, encouraging people to view others as brothers, urging the wealthy, powerful, and fortunate to actually aid the poor, weak, and unfortunate through charity, while admonishing the latter to guard against envy and hatred as well, as emphasized in sermons and pastoral letters of the period, such as those by Bernard of Clairvaux advocating for Christian charity. So this was a free world where you could decide whether to do that or not, but you could not endanger the societal hierarchy, right? So obviously this was an idealized vision of coexistence, and though forcefully and repeatedly proclaimed, is sharply jarring with numerous events that the paucity of the documentation cannot obscure, such as the same peasant revolts that, again, stemmed from the mostly the, again, also the failure of the establishment is also the failure of the people, and vice versa. Like, there is not ever such a distinction to be made. When the entire system is in crisis, there is an imbalance at some level in that you have, in order to survive as a civilization, to rebalance. This is how the Jacquerie was resolved, as the same, I don't know, the English peasant revolt of 1381 was resolved. Of course, there were demands, as you know, for reduced taxes, abolition of serfdom, greater social equity of some sort, and there are also the 1323, 1328 Flemish revolt against feudal dues. All these resulted in pure disaster. They only weakened society. They did not bring anything. They actually worsened the living conditions of people. You would think that actually the church was right after all. I made multiple videos explaining how among these heresies there was incredibly violent and aggressive, pacifistic hypocrisy that, of course, was trying just to endanger and limit the power of the establishment. Lesser people always try that, but they always fail. Fortunately, just at some point, the elite can also weaken and so create this perennial sort of ups and downs. But, of course, I'm not even going to digress on the obvious, enormous civilizational compactness and effectiveness of the Catholic Church. The fact throughout probably the booming phases of the Middle Ages, it proved at its greatest extent, in fact, its capacity of not just of rule, but also of Christian compaction, of realignment towards more say, important objectives such as the expansion of Saint Christendom, in managing to preserve the Catholic Orthodox ideology, and more, also taking over those outer churches that had been failing, such as the Greek one as well. So we see an enormous capacity of the system to compact itself on the basis of this most obvious considerations. There must be a solidarity that, however, does not have to exceed in some sort of excessive imposition, nor in some complete lack of, sympathy for others. We are, of course, not always able to uncover these thoughts, aspirations, or motivations of those involved, or more precisely of those who sought better conditions and greater rights at some point, foremost among them over many centuries, the right to liberty, not to freedom, because freedom equated exactly to that subversion of morality. Like, if you still think that you can have freedom as a human being, just God can have freedom, right? You can have liberty that is conducive to God, so freedom. But in that sense, just by basic elementary politics, history, philosophy, theology, you're not even knowing what you're talking about. And liberty entails this constant work of growth in developing your muscles on the basis of properly Catholic power, as God bestows it on the powerful, and freedom intended as some sort of hysterical alienation from reality, where you think you can make it out there on their own, is anti-Catholic. It's anti-Christian. It doesn't have any universal precedent. Nobody believed in this before, or it pertained again only to individuals that were seeking to be God themselves, and definitely achieving way more than you could ever dream to achieve, even if you lived for 1,000 lives in this alleged freedom. And again, living off of accumulated wealth in the fringes of somewhere, trying to act free in the nature, etc. It just means that you are probably a mentally disturbed person, surely with not much going on in their lives. And any kind of form of asceticism historically was Catholically revolving around bringing this power back into the world, which doesn't seem exactly in parallel with this phenomena society is heading towards, and surprise, in fact, in a moment of stagnation and crisis of some sort. So there are instances in which, for example, the urban workers rebel. This is seen in formation of craft guilds in cities like Brugge and Ghent, except, again, these systems ended up collapsing under the burden of their own basically incapacity to coordinate, right? These estates did not really have a political culture to manage the system. We explained how basically the collapse of the Flemish trade was due to the complete mismanagement of the same Flemish communes, as long as they for a while, by the way, they managed to stay out of feudal authority, under which they were brutally reled to. So nullifying all the efforts, including the one of Courtrai. In fact, we are looking at this sort of rights to association issued in the same year of the Battle of the Golden Spurs by the charters of the Matin of Brugge, as negotiated labor conditions and secured privileges, but in a context of actual war, and I would add civil war of some sort, because rebelling to the Flemish feudal authority in that sense was to fight still with basically the same people, not much French agents. Besides, we know again how it all ended, and there is really a brusque collapse economically wise in the 20s of the 40s, even before the Great Crisis in other places. So if you want to fight feudal authority, either you come up with something better than that, as some public state, or there is no way out of this. In fact, the Italians had a bit the same problems, but on a completely different level, meaning that there were uprisings, urban uprisings, like the 1378 Ciompi revolt we've seen with the salaried workers, the aforementioned VU, that, however, was brutally brought down by the same Florentine city-state that was, first of all, a guild system. Basically, the Ciompi had rebelled exactly to be included in the government. These are basically exploited by the government temporarily and then put down. Right, so there you see the case of a state that is self-reliant and successfully put down these revolts without... There was internal damage, admittedly, in the process, because again, if you allow the fourth essayers to cause this mess, you're always going to pay as a civilization yourself. It's not normal to have people rebelling in the streets, even if they are the worst. Still, you are, as a power, meant to catholically prevent that from even happening from your own kind of power background. As you understand, there is always a moral question here. It's not like these guys were simply rebelling because, I don't know, economy was going bad. Why was economy going bad? People's choices. There is no such thing like a random economy going, right? What is beautiful is that all these movements cannot be separated from the ideological implications of these rebellions. Again, economy does not dictate this for some, broader, economical... At the time, they would have had some theories of how things worked, and again, we don't often know what this urban workers expressly thought, but we can see from their religious instances that they had an incredibly superficial understanding of the Bible, right? They had basically a literal interpretation of church teachings, which means that you literally do not understand what you're reading. And in fact, also a strange, consider that there is not, even today, you can argue, if you look at YouTube, for example, like anybody but me making, I'm not kidding, I would like to be more, let's say, more modest, but let's say, is there a history of the church that people have any clue of? No, right? So imagine, again, still today, people talking about these things, literally getting nowhere in the process without any surprise. There was this emphasis on the sort of the more liminal aspect. This would be of theological explanations, say at times willingly ambiguous necessities that were to be found mostly in the apostolic literature, was often invoked in sermons and writings by reformist preachers such as John Wycliffe, who criticized ecclesiastical wealth, again, not understanding what that is about. Even just by, again, this is not by theological implications, but really this is always the problem with communists, with utopists, like how do you actually manage a church without the church having actual resources on its own? And these were, again, objectively, considering the actual philosophy existing in the previous centuries, this is incredibly cheap philosophy. It's not innovative, if not in the sense that, again, was basically rejecting the most high advanced, sophisticated means of the great medieval universal civilizational education to, we want to steal essentially from other people, trying to clothe this as, for some reason we deserve things without even explaining how, for example, the Holy Ghost would think about that to begin with. These are always communistic, Manichaean, dualistic heresies at the end of the day. They're hysterical about wealth and money to begin with. There are many instances of these, this veritable sense of ungratefulness, of resentment. Think about the Franciscan spirituals, this heretical fringe that hid within the Franciscan order before they sort of broke out when they were hoping to spread their theory in the faculty of theology in Paris of the Sorbonne, emphasizing just poverty, equality, advocating for terms like social, justice, communal equality. So the idea that basically what you've read from the Bible you have not understood anything of, like thinking that Christ is literally saying, we discussed this, when was it, the other day regarding the wealth. Yeah, was known to early Christian literature very well, that wealth was not intended like if you are rich, you cannot literally go to heaven because Christ used a parable in which this was, say, at least it's very difficult. That simply means you will be more easily distracted and you don't have to think about that, putting it at the center. Again, I discussed this recently in the video about how, in fact, the early Christians actually supported the empire, and how just the communist fringe interpreted these passages in a random way. Among the least developed in the empire, the most superficially Romanized elements of the empire, ones that would eventually break away, ending up under the control of other countries. So it's something appalling in the repetition of that of the same dynamic, and it's really painful to see how, again, still today, like you think that people can simply read the Bible and understand in it, as if there wasn't a work entailed, right? The Bible is not the place where you can fish your random quotes and pretending that that's how you interpret them, right? You have to literally sacrifice yourself in the process. If you just start from the presumption that the point of people is that they shouldn't sacrifice themselves, you're basically, or which is what communists essentially want, you basically, somebody else who's sacrificing yourself, you basically are out of any possible Catholic understanding. You're just zero. It's over. It's useless for you to even read or to do anything. In fact, in Catholicism, that equates to literal death, and that where all these movements ended up, in spite of the fact that the same elite was weakening. That's where you have the Protestant Reformation that brings eventually to atheism straight away. So simply misusing the Acts of the Apostles to justify demands for a more equitable society, and therefore disturbing biblical narratives for your own poor ends, was sadly like something simply opening to a big deal, also fractioning of the actual Catholic body, of the traditional body, that emphasis, that ethos on the necessity of unity first and foremost to be powerful, and then to resolve matters internally. That's why there were also confraternities and reformist clergy who tried to find new ways and see where they ended up, right? The Hussites destroying literally 1/3 of their own country to dust, to eventually lose, or to remain like essentially a fringe country from like the previous century, where it had literally been the beating heart of Europe. All these movements in general also being, if you've seen the German peasants' revolts, like this later tail strikes that, again, other than opening to the broader Protestant issue, that at that point, say, highlighted the tension existing concerning the issues of the papacy, of the establishment in general, does not really gain anything. Like, people lost liberty throughout all these movements, and they did not bring to a better society in medieval times, and also later, right? The Inquisition was notoriously a much better, more functional system than normal lay tribunals, for not talking about the ad hoc ones that administrated issues in the Protestant world. No doubt it was much better to be handled by the Inquisition than by other tribunals. This is very well established by historiography without any debate. And you find, if anything, a better justice system occurring only later on, when the state, if anything, comes into play and stops acting simply on the basis of anti-traditional attitudes. It sort of creates more power, as if there was like a universal empire within the same country, and so improved, if anything, the preconditions, like restoring that general principle of justice always inspired to the Catholic tradition, that, however, also in some ways was not really helping further the the individual reconquest, let's say, of power, but entrusting itself ever more to the state, that again was essentially a mechanism that successfully coped with the collapse of the individual, rather than the other way around, right? So everything is the consequence of something else, right? It's not due to some progressistic development, but it's not even due to the fact that, so now we destroy the state and people can rest on their legs. Absolutely not. People today are complete slobs that do not even understand the meaning anymore of why there is a state, even though they actually enjoy its benefits far and wide. Also too much, because in fact there are too many rights and not enough duties as actually the same state should be founded on. Also to show that the institutional form does not reveal to you how morally superior a system actually is, right? So that you can have different systems that have different performance simply because it's about the quality of the people. And yeah, we're told that the West is, which is also why the West remains at the top, regardless of deviations that you can see generating the same struggle within, which is a sign of vitality, as opposed to other systems that claim that are not traditional at all, because they don't actually understand nor the religion, nor they hate it, or they have eliminated it to degrees, and that are incredibly underperforming and actually having much lower social, properly, in terms of social fabric, families do not exist, they explode, they're completely incapable of replicating what the West does at any level, and if they are actually minimally developed, it's because of Western influence. Today's topic naturally is pretty broad, so we could and will surely discuss all this stuff in greater depth in different videos dedicated to each of them. It's not easy to discuss these topics because it feels like at some point they're too broad and that they don't thus satisfy the audience as far as the precision of it is concerned. But let's say it's important, as I always say, to talk also at these broader levels, because if you don't do so, you will have people convincing themselves that without, first of all, if they don't, this happens often on Schwerpunkt, as on YouTube in general. People think that if you're talking about something, it's because you're cheering for something, and they don't even watch the video, they listen to what you're saying. But it will remain sclerotically, just fixated to that dimension. If you open the dimension and you start putting things in comparison, that I do in every of my video, even the sort of very in-depth ones about very sort of relatively narrower topics, they will start realizing that the measures they thought that this whole thing was about are actually wrong, are actually false. They have dreamt all along of a world that does not exist and never existed, because it should not exist. Because the actual world that does not exist, if anything, is from the other side, and they're not even understanding what it means to turn their head towards that side. This is unfortunately how you have to treat people nowadays, and again, it's particularly complicated. Anyway, for today, I stop it here. We'll keep talking about similar topics. There is a broad medieval society playlist for this as well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.